All right, I want to welcome everybody who's here tonight. Let me get my little video started. I'm going to give you a little warning though. My lighting is really weird. My light bulb burned out, so I've got this weird lighting right now and my face looks really red. But so there's your warning. My face is not usually as red as it's about to appear. All right, but hello. I'm so glad everybody's able to join us tonight. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces. So those of you who are not familiar with the Brenn Clinic, I'm assuming most of you are since you're here, but we're fairly new in our area. And this is, I think, our third or fourth webinar that we've put on because of all the uncertainty with COVID and the regulations and the law and how everything interacts and all of the uncertainties. We've done a few webinars to try and just put some information out there and answer questions. And that again is exactly what we're hoping to do tonight. Before we get into details, I'd like to introduce our guest tonight, Nikki Kresbox. She is a partner at Krebsbach, and I know her. I've had the pleasure of working with her for over a year now. She practices primarily special education law, advocating for the civil rights of children with special needs to ensure a free, appropriate public education under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And I can tell you from experience, she is very passionate about special education. So I have included, there we go. Okay, so I have included her information there. I have a very touchy mouse, excuse me. So there is information on her law firm if you want to look her up and a little bit more about her practice. They are based down in Visalia, but I'll let Nikki tell you a little bit more about her firm and her practice. Oh, you're on mute still, Nikki. There we go.
How's that?
That's better.
All right. Thank you, Jodie. Hi, everyone. Good evening, wherever you are watching from. I'm grateful to be here again with Jodie. We did this, Jodie, about 4 or 5 months ago as well, I think.
In March, I believe it was right after the closures. Yeah.
Right after the guidance came out from the U.S. Department of Education. So I'm happy to be back here doing this with you again. Thank you for the opportunity. As Jodie said, my name is Nikki Krebsbach, and I'm an attorney admitted to practice in California. I currently represent families with special education issues, mainly in the Central Valley of California, but now with the world being as it is today with all things virtual, we can really extend our representation up and down the state, which is wonderful. I am a parent of 3, and like you all, trying to navigate their education during this worldwide pandemic. And as hard as it is, I'm not dealing with educating some of our most vulnerable students, and I empathize with all of you. This is going to be an informative evening tonight, I promise, but I wish we could provide you with some solid answers as to what the education of your child will look like in the coming weeks and months. But the truth of the matter is there's so many uncertainties, so many unknowns. The laws in this area have not been challenged yet, have not even been created yet. And so we're kind of operating in a big black hole right now. And as I listened to one of my colleagues on the East Coast say, she wishes she had a crystal ball on her desk, or at least a magic 8-ball that could help her answer some of these questions. So I apologize in advance because so many of the questions we get from you today, we're going to say, honestly, we just don't know. But we've tried to put together some valuable information for you so you can take away at least some nuggets to help you face the start of the school year for many of you this week.
Thank you, Nikki. We are really fortunate to have her in our community and with us here tonight. My name is Jodie. I'm the director of the Brenn Clinic. So the Brenn Clinic, like I said a few minutes ago, it's very new. Unlike Nikki, we're under our funding is to provide services locally. So I know some of you may be joining us from outside the Fresno County, Tulare County, Central Valley area here in California, and you're welcome to join us on the webinar. And Nikki may be a resource for you. However, at this time, the Brenn Clinic funding is geographically somewhat limited, but it is still, I believe, a service that our geographic area is in need of. And hopefully the Brenn Clinic serves as a valuable resource for parents advocating for their children's rights. And to echo some of what Nikki said, Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of answers, right? As attorneys, we're used to studying the law, studying cases to find out how the courts are applying the law. And right now, there's uncertainty as to even some of the law, let alone how it's going to be interpreted by courts. But we have put together what I think will be some helpful information, along with a lot of we're going to have to wait and see, right? But let's get into that. Here's our disclaimer for the evening. Most importantly, you need to understand that nothing that we share here tonight is legal advice. None of it should be construed as legal advice. In order for it technically to constitute legal advice, we have to know a lot about the details of your situation. And while we hopefully will have time for Q&A at the end, those are going to be general questions. And we're not going to be able to get into the nitty-gritty details and actually give you legal advice, at least not here at this webinar. The responses presented in this discussion tonight generally constitute informal opinions and interpretations of recent guidance. So again, we're looking at guidance documents and not even technically, I mean, we are going to look at some of the law too, but a lot of this is based off guidance documents, which are not as controlling in court as a law would be. But those guidance documents will have been issued by the Federal Department of Education, and I should have included also our state Department of Education. We got a couple things we're going to look at from the California Department of Education as well, regarding applicable statutory and regulatory requirements in the context of COVID-19 related regulations. So that's really what we're focusing on tonight. And to get us started, did you have something, Nikki?
Yeah, I would actually add a kind of another disclaimer, but of a different sort. Nothing we're going to say here tonight has any political undertone. There are many forces at play here, including, like Jodie said, federal and state governments, local districts, teachers unions, a whole host of other things. But we're not taking a position for or against, just trying to relay to you the facts as best we can. So that's my disclaimer. Jodie gave the lawyer disclaimer, and I'm giving the political disclaimer.
Both applicable to both of us. Thank you. Nikki's going to get us started off with a discussion about what is distance learning.
Okay, thank you. So, and this I think is going to be our overarching message to you. And then we're going to kind of fill in below, but I see it everywhere from the US Department of Education website to the California Department of Education guidance. There has been no waiver of any rights under IDEA during this pandemic. Schools are still required to provide FAPE, a free, appropriate public education, no matter what the delivery method, no matter what the uncertainty or the question marks, or the schools are held accountable for not providing FAPE. And we're going to talk about what that means later, and maybe some of our suggestions on how to, hold them accountable and hold their feet to the fire for not providing. The districts have some real challenges ahead of them, as do we. Nothing looks like it did or will look like we thought it would. Special ed kids are not getting the education that we expected, and school is going to look different in different states, in different towns, in different schools within the same district, and different, possibly within the brick and mortar schoolhouse if California goes back to school. I'm not sure where most of you are watching from, but of course here in California, we're going to be distance learning at least for 9 weeks. But I do know that there are still states out there that are going to be headed back to school. And so those parents are facing lots of different questions in terms of which model they're going to be selecting or advocating for in their IEP meetings. There's so little known about COVID right now that, we've got metrics and numbers of cases adjusted for population, and numbers look different on any given hour of any given day. And so the fact of the matter is that decisions are being made right now on not a whole lot of facts. We don't really know if children under 10 can contract COVID. How do they react and how do they transmit the disease? This makes district's treatment of elementary schools versus older grades very different, modeled differently. So until we have, some dramatically different research results or, a spike in numbers, everything is going to look, just very different, I think, than we expected. If something changes here in California, and we find that students to some extent can go back to the traditional in-school model, it is somewhat easier to put these children in small groups and maintain small cohorts. We can successfully socially distance a little bit better there in the older grades. In the younger grades, that's more difficult. Those children may have difficulty keeping their masks on. They may have difficulty keeping their hands off of their friends that they haven't seen in a while. It's just going to be so varied from school to school and district to district and grade to grade. Here in California, we were part of the initial lockdown, and we were locked down pretty tight, and we still are. Initially we had some hope over the summer that schools were being advised to use metrics to determine to what level they would return to school. The State Department of Education website can provide some good information on the metrics that the districts are using, but at least for the meantime, the one thing we know is that we're not going back to the traditional in-school model for at least a little over 2 months. No matter what the schools look like, there are different modalities which are possible. In talking with my colleagues, I gather there's a lot of confusion out there about different terms. What is homeschool? What is homebound? What is distance learning? I know my 3 children are going back to school and they're distance learning, but I really didn't know what that meant until I spent some time listening to a colleague on the East Coast describe this to me. And every day new words are popping up. I just learned the term 2 days ago, synchronous learning. And now we've got more information to process. So I'd like to kind of lay out for you the big black hole of distance learning. So there are a few terms that everybody agrees on. Synchronous learning, for those of you that have heard that term or haven't heard that term, means students learning at the same time. So this can be in a classroom or it can be virtual, but it just means students learning concurrently. And then you juxtapose that against non-synchronous or asynchronous learning, and that's where students are learning the same material, but at different times and in different locations. And then there are big differences in computer-based learning. Computer-based learning can be synchronous or it can be asynchronous. But we mostly hear about computer-based terms referred to as online learning versus virtual learning. So here's the main difference. And I think this is particularly relevant to the California watchers because we know we're going to be distance learning for at least some time. So online learning is learning that uses computer and web-based tools and platforms that allow teachers to post student content and assignments, and those students complete those assignments independently. There's not any interaction with the teachers. So this method involves an asynchronous approach. Students who can't work this way are challenged pretty significantly by the lack of support because there's nobody there interacting with them real time. This also puts a bigger burden on the parents to be very involved. First, they have to learn the technology, and then they have to learn the content because they teach things differently now than when we were in school, while the parents are trying to do their regular normal activities like work and feed the family and do laundry. So it's difficult. There is almost no socialization for the children with an online learning model. Now that said, certainly there are some students that this has worked really well for, but in general, I feel my experience has taught me that this type of learning can be very, very difficult for children in special education who require more support and more intensive interaction. So that was online learning under the heading of distance learning. The second type of computer-based learning is virtual instruction. And so as you can probably imagine, virtual instruction involves a live teacher who provides instruction in real time. Virtual instruction most typically uses a video conferencing platform, and this allows the teacher to deliver the lesson plans much like they would in the typical classroom, typical brick and mortar. So this is exactly what we're doing here today. This is either Zoom or Google Meets or Facebook Live, and in virtual instruction, students can ask questions, they can get clarity, and they can get answers in real time. They can interact with the content instantly and with the teacher's support. So this allows interaction with peers when that virtual instruction is synchronous. And then there's another kind of subheading under distance learning, computer-based distance learning, which is e-learning. And this is, just a general term for using electronic technology outside of the classroom to access educational curriculum. So when it comes to what your child is receiving or is going to receive under the heading of distance learning, make sure you understand exactly what that is. Don't let them say to you, we're going to be distance learning. Press them and ask them exactly what that's going to look like. If you receive a notice that your school will be distance learning, you send them an email for clarification. Ask them whether it's going to be live or recorded. Ask them if it's going to be synchronous or asynchronous. And if several different modalities will be used throughout the day, ask them what the breakdown is going to be, because the districts need to know that in advance. And I can't imagine that they don't know that at this time. School starts, we're in the 11th hour, so they should be able to provide you with that information. So just know what your child is going to be receiving, how they'll be delivering that, and that will help you navigate them through at least the next 9 weeks.
See, there's so much that I just learned a lot from that. So there's so much we don't know about what we don't know, right? Thank you. That was a great introduction to this whole concept of distance learning, which really leads us into what I think most of our conversation is going to focus on today. Just so you know, we have a few rough slides. Most of this is going to be Nikki and I as attorneys kind of conversing with each other about what our thoughts are regarding these ideas. And again, the reason we've designed this webinar this way is because there's not a lot of certainty as to how the law is going to be applied in these situations. So hearing our conversation with each other will hopefully get some of your ideas flowing, your creative juices, how you can approach the school district to try and help your student at this time. And one of the concepts we'd like to introduce is the idea of an individualized distance learning plan. So we've all heard about individualized education plans. In fact, most of you here probably have an IEP for your child or a 504. And it kind of falls in that, it does fall in that same realm of, if our child is entitled by law to an individualized education plan, then why should their distance learning plan not be individualized as well, right? So in the initial scramble in March, on March 13th, most of our districts put out a mandate saying, following guidance and things saying we're doing our school closure. And it was an initial mad scramble to get any kind of distance learning out to our kids. And every district did it a little differently. And it was, even as a parent, I am a parent of a child with a disability who has an IEP. As a parent and as an attorney, I appreciated the fact that there was no way they could do an individualized distance learning plan for all of those students that quickly, right? So I was willing and did cut the school district for my own son some slack. And I knew that it was going to take some time to get to the point where we were able to individualize some of these. Well, that being said, we're now months later, right? We've had some time. We as parents, they as the school district, and yeah, maybe not time to individualize everybody's plan, but we've had time to think about it. We've seen what's happened when our child was given a non-individualized distance learning plan. And I dare say many of us probably, if it echoes my own son's experience, saw many of his individualized services seem to just disappear because there was it's very difficult to find a way to deliver some of those services. But we've had time. We need to now address the fact that we're going back to school and it's going to be distance learning of some sort. And now we need to find a way to individualize those plans. So that's kind of what we're going to be focusing on right now. I did tell everybody, go ahead and put your questions in the chat. It is difficult for me to multitask everything, but I'm going to try and look over there every once in a while, and we'll get to some of the questions if we're able to, and if we have time at the end, we'll also do some Q&A. Okay, so what is an individualized distance learning plan? And like I said, Nikki, chime in here with any of your thoughts along the way. This slide was meant to kind of help you get the idea of distance learning as a general plan versus an individualized plan here on that green side. So an individualized distance learning plan would have to be developed by the IEP team, just like your individualized education plan would. You're part of the team that determines how your child learns best, what kind of services they need, how those services should be delivered. That's what we always talk about in IEPs. So why would a distance learning model be any different? Why would we not be part of the team that helps determine of those different, Nikki even gave us some options of different types of distance learning. And then we've got different ways to deliver different types of programs and modalities. Those are conversations you need to be having with your IEP team, and not just developed by the team, but actually incorporated into your child's existing IEP. So in a couple of slides, I'm going to mention a term, and we'll talk about it in another couple of slides, but well, I guess I've already introduced it, but this concept of your child's IEP can have a component inside of it that is an individualized distance learning plan. And later on, we're going to talk about what that means to have a separate component of your IEP. So there's all these different sections to your IEP, our common typical sections of present levels, goals, services. Your child's IEP could have another little section of here's a contingent plan that we implement when we're facing distance learning. For whatever our reason is, if our child is learning by distance learning, now how does that change things? What are the components that need to be in place, and how will our child be taught? So you want to think about it as outlining in detail how the school is going to mirror what's already in your child's IEP. So like I said, initially in the mad scramble, we didn't really know how we were going to do this, but we've had some time now to kind of come up with some ideas and some possible solutions. So factors to keep in mind are who is going to deliver the service, when. So you want to know like times of day, how frequent, is it going to be every week? Is it going to be every month? Can we break it down into 10-minute segments 3 times a day instead of one 30-minute segment? Things like that. That's our when. And then our how. How is it going to be delivered? And we'll get into some more of this in a few more slides. It should also outline how the school is going to measure progress and take data. In order to do that, we have to have baselines. Now that introduces a whole nother problem of how do we get those baselines right now? Because that requires assessments. Now, Nikki, I know you mentioned to me earlier today when we were chatting for a few minutes that you have some assessments currently going on. Can you talk a little bit about how are they doing assessments with all of these distance learning or COVID restrictions in place?
Sure. So for my cases, my caseload here, there are no evaluations going on. Well, certainly not during the summer, of course, but when the closure happened in March, assessments completely went on hold. And all I heard was, we have to wait. But back then it was 2 weeks. We were going to be closed for 2 weeks. And then it was, we're closed until the end of May. And then it was June. And so I don't want to say they kept getting kicked down the road, but there was no movement whatsoever on assessments, which is very troubling. I have clients that are actually relocating into different school districts, and so we have an incomplete battery of assessments that, you know, I was just hoping to get that completed that could travel with the child to the new district. And so, you know, as we move to the new district, that district has the option of starting all over again. So, you know, I was pushing for those clients that were willing to bring their child in person with masks and socially distanced, and we can do all of this safe. We're navigating through our world safely every day, or doing the best that we can. And the answer that I got was no. There's nobody willing to meet with the child in person. So there are other options that we can take a look at. We can take a look at outside third-party providers. What third-party providers are willing to meet with the child and conduct in-person assessments? That's a question that you would just need to ask the district. If you can find someone, if you can find a provider who's willing to do that, bring that possibility to the school district and ask that question. Will the school district hire this, you know, this psychologist or this psychiatrist to, you know, to complete this if the school for whatever reason is not able to do that in person? And you can ask for anything you want, and the district can tell you yes or no, but they also have to tell you why the answer is no. Also why the answer is yes, but you're mostly interested in why the answer is no. I learned earlier today from talking with a colleague that I know of a child whose assessment was completed outside at a park over the summer by a neuropsych and Medi-Cal actually paid for that. So not that everybody has access to that kind of a resource or that kind of a funding source, but I think the takeaway here is, or the message here is, get creative and really dig down deep and try to brainstorm and offer those brainstormed ideas to the school district, and with a collaborative spirit and a a gentle approach, hopefully we can get some of those assessments done.
And what do you think, Nikki? If we're really looking at the concept of how does the child learn, how do they access distance learning? Seems to me like it would be completely appropriate, if that's really what we're looking at, to do an assessment virtually, do it online, because if that's how they're going to be taught, and that's really the question we're addressing, is specifically talking about an individualized distance learning plan. If we need to know how they best access it, maybe we need to do assessments about how they're accessing different things online.
Right. Very, very good point, Jodie. Present level of performance is, everybody understands what that is, but you're right, that's an assumption that the present level of performance in the classroom with a teacher in front of that child. And we have to face the facts now, and I'm a late adopter. I have had my head in the sand a little bit as it pertains to the status of education today. We have to be realistic that this is our world now, and we are going to see a lot more interaction like we're doing exactly here tonight. And, one of the biggest articulated fears I hear from my clients is my child is not getting the socialization that he needs. We had made great strides in social emotional, skills. And now my child is just sliding down the scale of, his deficits are growing bigger and bigger. And how can we get that child the social interaction? The problem is, though, that distance learning doesn't provide the easy, effortless social interaction from just sitting in a classroom next to another student, whether that student is a special ed student or a general ed student. But we have to figure out ways to deliver services and deliver the special ed services virtually, because this is the world that our children live in now. And there are so many different ways to deliver distance learning, computer-based social services, and we just need to kind of commit to opening our minds up and just really digging deep for that. You're absolutely right, Jodie. We have to really kind of embrace this new medium, because this is how it is for at least the short-term future.
Yeah, we don't know how long it's going to be around, and even if we do go back, there's always the possibility of the school needing to close because of some outbreak, and we want to have that distance learning plan individualized and shelved, right? Even if we're back in brick and mortar learning, we want to be able to quickly pull that back off the little IEP shelf and say, okay, let's reinstitute that individualized distance learning plan. And so if we've got some of that data about how they learn online, what do they respond to better than others, what types of modalities or instruction, then we'll know better how to do that, how to individualize their plan.
So Jodie, I just want to emphasize here, you're talking about a component of an IEP. It's either an addendum or a new section that fits somewhere logically in the IEP document that is triggered only upon a distance learning platform, right?
Yes, I think that's our next slide, actually, that kind of helps clarify. So, okay, so we're getting there. I do want to introduce to you the source of information I'm about to get. So this is information from the original March 12th, I believe it was March 12th, 2020, guidance document that was issued by the Federal Department of Education. So the reason I remember it being March 12th is the very next day, it was like the sky was falling, right? That was the Friday the 13th when the world shut down. So the day before that, we got this guidance document from the Federal Department of Education. Within their own document, they recognize that this is just a Q&A document. It does not impose any additional requirements beyond those included in applicable law and regulations. The responses presented in this document generally constitute informal guidance representing the interpretation of the department of the applicable statutory or regulatory requirements, blah, blah, blah. So they're not legally binding, right? The whole point of this little disclaimer by the Federal Department of Education was, what we're about to tell you is just guidance, right? You can't take it necessarily to court and say they have to do this, but you can take it to, say, court and say, look, this was guidance offered, and it can be influential. So just keep that in mind. But this is the document that I'm about to take a piece of information from. And this is where the idea of this individualized distance learning plan in my mind was introduced. So here was question 5. May an IEP team consider a distance learning plan in a child's IEP as a contingency plan in the event of the outbreak requiring the school to close? And the answer is yes. But they may, but are not required to. So again, there's no law that says they have to have this contingency plan in there. However, usually special education law is predicated on this assumption that we're trying to put together the appropriate plan for our child. If it is appropriate for our child to have an individualized plan because they can't learn with the general distance learning plan, then to me, that would be the argument in place to say, hey, it's appropriate for this child to have an individualized distance learning plan. Now, it doesn't take the place of the IEP. It's not like we take the IEP that they had and toss it out the window and create a new one. Your child's IEP remains intact. We just add a different section, an additional section to your child's IEP that is triggered and implemented only when they're not attending school because of the COVID-19 outbreak. Now we've got a distance learning plan individualized to that child that if they need to, because of COVID-19 restrictions, need to be taught at home, we can dust off that little distance learning plan section of the IEP and implement it. When they're back in the brick and mortar campuses, that gets shelved. We don't have to throw it out because who knows when we'll be back, but we don't have to follow it when they're on campus learning in person. So I hope if that clarifies, hopefully that makes sense, that I'm not proposing we toss out the IEP and start a new one. No, not in any way. I'm proposing that an individualized distance learning plan can be put into each of our children's IEP and triggered and implemented when they're facing distance learning. And it even goes on to say that plan can include what circumstances would trigger it. So you can even talk about when will this distance learning plan be applied. You can talk about what those triggers are right there in the plan itself.
Jodie, talk a little bit about why it's important that it not take the place of the IEP, but that it works there together. It's either one or the other. And talk about why that's so important as far as, not triggering a change of placement if one superseded the other.
Okay, so there's really a couple things there. The first thing, before we even address placement, I think one of the first things to consider and to appreciate is your child didn't change because of COVID, right? Their needs might have changed because now they have to be taught in a different way, but it's not like what they need when they're back in school at brick and mortar changed simply because the world had a COVID-19 outbreak. Now, maybe their needs are going to change down the road because they've been out of brick and mortar so long, so now they might need some additional help. But just the COVID-19 itself did not change your child, right? So to say we no longer need the old IEP would be completely false. Your child still needs what we had already agreed on, right? That signed IEP that was in place on March 12th is still what your child arguably needs until we show otherwise. But when we're facing distance learning, those needs are different because the way services can be delivered are different. The types of services that can be delivered sometimes are even different. So that's one thing to just kind of generally speaking understand. But the one thing that makes me a little bit nervous about people thinking, well, we'll just replace this and make it a different IEP is there's this, if you're familiar with placement, right, we have a right, our children with disabilities have a right to be educated in the least restrictive environment. And that's arguably where your child is right now, where they were being educated on March 12th, hopefully, right? But we're always trying to get our children to be in that least restrictive environment. Can they be educated with other non-disabled children for longer parts of the day or for the entire day or whatever it is? But the least restrictive environment of all is that gen ed classroom. And that's where we want our child to try and spend more time and be with their non-disabled peers. But here, by educating our children at home, it looks a lot like something called home instruction, right? But that's not what we're doing. We're not saying I want my child to be home instructed. That's a different placement, and that puts us down on the most restrictive level of the placement. So by just having a provisional part of the IEP that gets implemented, triggered and implemented just at certain times because of distance learning should not change your child's placement. That means when distance learning is no longer required and they can go back to school, they should go right back to the same type of classroom they were being educated in before the closures. And that's something that's really important for you to remember, is we're not saying we think our children should be taught at home. That we're not saying that's the appropriate placement for them. What we're saying is when they have to be taught at home because of COVID, what is it that we need to change about how they're being taught? Not that we're agreeing that this more restrictive environment is appropriate.
And be very careful about agreeing to anything that could be construed as a change of placement, because Jodie, when you and I were talking earlier today, you made a comment, and I absolutely, it resonated with me that it seems to be, and I'm quoting you, but I'm probably going to misquote you. It seems to be a lot easier to move your child into a more restrictive environment than it is to get that child out of that restrictive environment. And I know that that is not a popular sentiment, and there are likely people watching right now that would vehemently disagree with that. But just whatever your child's placement is right now, protect that and be careful that you don't inadvertently change that placement to something more restrictive, because you're gonna have to fight to get that child out of that to a less restrictive environment. So, and that's why we're really advocating for adding this this condition subsequent, to use a legal term, kind of rider, if you will, in the child's IEP that is only triggered upon the condition of distance learning. So because,
and again,
like,
that it does not replace the IEP in any way, it adds to it only during distance learning time. So building on that, hopefully now you all, and again, this is because we have such a large group of people, I'm so glad you're all here, but it does make it a little more difficult to go, okay, does everybody understand, right, before we move on. But hopefully that gives you an idea of what an individualized distance learning plan at least is. So how do you get one of these started? Well, you're gonna have to start by requesting an IEP meeting. And I put in here ASAP, right? I would do it as soon as possible. So the way the law is written, and this did not change, this particular timeline was not waived and did not change. When you make a request, I always suggest, and any attorney is probably going to make the same suggestion, do it in writing, turn in a written request to have an IEP meeting, and specifically tell them, I want to have an IEP meeting to discuss an individualized distance learning plan. Don't hide the ball. Let them know right up front what it is you want to talk about. When you do that, it starts a 30-day clock. Oh, see, I typed this up so quick, I didn't put the word day in here. It should be 30-day clock, not a 30 clock. It starts a 30-day clock. But that clock, if you were to turn it in tomorrow, it's not actually going to start until the school year starts. But that's next week, right? So turn it in, and if you get it in before school starts, then that very first day of school, that will start the 30-day clock. They now have 30 days to hold an IEP meeting and talk to you about what your concerns are. Now, one of my pieces of advice to you here is be flexible. We had another guidance document issued, I believe in April, by the Federal Department of Education. And it basically said, built into IDEA, I'm paraphrasing here, but built into IDEA was this ability for both sides, the school district and the parents, to be flexible. There are ways we can say, I'm willing to, for example, I'm willing to excuse team members that I would normally say, no, I want them at the meeting. But think about how many parents, even if every one of us, there are over 100 of us here at this webinar. If all 100 of us turned in, that's still a lot of IEPs, right? So if we're willing to be a little bit flexible with the school district, maybe you have to have it at an odd time. Maybe it has to be a little short meeting and you have another little short meeting a week later. Instead of a 3-hour meeting, you have a 1 hour or a 30-minute meeting, with the understanding of, if we haven't reached that decision, maybe we can have another short little meeting. Things I would normally not advocate for, we may need to be a little bit more flexible with that, so that they can facilitate the influx of meetings that need to happen, and to do it quickly. They have 30 days, but they don't have to take the full 30 days, right? They can start holding these meetings as soon as the school year comes back. So I'll tell you right now, I've already emailed my son's teacher and gotten a response from her that they're going to try and get that meeting together. And who exactly am I willing to waive their attendance for so that we can make the meeting happen even quicker? And I've already started that communication line with my son's teacher. Another thing, go to the meeting prepared. Don't just walk in going, I want an individualized distance learning plan, give it to me. You got to help them come up with ideas. You know your child. You know how they learn. You know the resources they're going to respond to. So if you've taken my class over at San Joaquin or a College of Law, I always use this word creative, and we need to do it even more now than we ever have before. We have to be creative. So what I propose is prior to this meeting, you actually start, I'm going to tell you to do two things. First, make a list. Prioritize your concerns regarding your child and their ability to access distance learning. Create that list and then reorganize it by priority, which is the most important thing, all the way down to the things that are they're of concern to you, but nothing compared to the things at the top, right? Put it in a prioritized list so that you can try and help your team start at the top. Before we talk about these little piddly things, let's address the big elephant here, the big elephant in the room or on the IEP. So have that prioritized list, but come with some proposed solutions. Now, you may find that they don't like any and they're going to shoot every single one of them down, but you've got to come in with at least some ideas. Hopefully they don't. Hopefully they are wanting to work with you. And I think if we go in with the attitude of, I want to be a team, that's how always, regardless of COVID or not, if we can work truly as a team, that's when our child really gets what they need, right? It's of no benefit to anybody when we become adversarial and fight each other. So go in with the attitude and the hope that they will be creative with you, that they will, but then always come with the understanding it may not happen that way, right? My mom always said, hope for the best and plan for the worst. That's great IEP advice right there. She wasn't talking IEPs, but it's still applicable. And then no, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. If you're proposing solutions and they're shooting them all down saying, no, we're not going to do any of them, we're not going to address that need, ask for that denial to be given to you by prior written notice. What this does is, and again, we're going to talk about it a little bit more, so I'll just briefly mention it here. It gives you a written document about not just what they're denying, but why they're telling you no. And that better informs you about maybe how you can readdress things when you call the next IEP meeting. Did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I sure do. Yeah. So just a little tidbit on the prior written notice. So I find that the districts that actually do issue prior written notices as a matter of regular course of action are few and far between. It's amazing to me when clients come and they say, well, I asked for this and the district said no. And I say, okay, can you send me the prior written notice so I can understand the reason that they said no? And I can't tell you how many times districts do not do that, but they are required to. They're actually required to give you a prior written notice anytime you ask for a service or make a request that they either accept or deny. They actually have to put it in writing. And that the basis for that is all about due process. The idea is that you have recourse. If you're told no, you can appeal the district's decision that they're not the final say. You can appeal that. And the idea behind due process is that how do you know if you should appeal or can appeal or what your options are if you don't know the reasons for their denial? So it's all about keeping you informed of your rights so that you know the fight that's in front of you. So insist on that. If they tell you no, say, and unfortunately there's no hard statutory timeline in IDEA as far as when the prior written notice has to be provided to you. I think it's, Jodie, within a reasonable time, I think. Yeah. As is reasonably applicable or something, but push for it. And if you push for it, then they'll know that you're educated and you're informed of your rights, and they might begin to treat you a little bit differently. So I would also say about being prepared. Jodie had suggested go into that meeting being prepared. I envision these, my crystal ball, my magic 8 ball tells me that these IEP meetings are going to be fast and furious because there's very little time. We should be addressing every single IEP that exists today because everything has changed. I'm looking at the comments or the questions here, and there's one district, and it's not identified which district, says that every student on an IEP will have an IEP within the first 3 days of school. I can't get my head around that. I don't know how that can possibly, as a practical matter, happen. So it's going to be fast. When you go in there and tell them what you have seen from your child, because you have been your child's primary teacher for the last 4 months, possibly. You know your child better than anybody else. What you might hear under normal circumstances is, well, we need to establish a baseline, or we need to, evaluate the child's present level at this time before we can make that decision. But we all know that, practically speaking, assessments are going to be very difficult right now during this time. So go in there with the data. Share with the team what your child's present level is right now, so that you don't have to hear, well, we can't make that decision because we don't know what the child's present level is. Jodie and I were looking at some guidance earlier tonight, either from the Department of Education, CDE, or the U.S. Department of Education.
I think it's our next slide right here.
All right. And what it does is it gives tremendous weight to parents and their, not perception, but parents, what parents feel is the child's present level. So I think in this time, she's going to get that, find that quote for us. This time more than any, your belief and feeling and reports of your child's present levels are more important than any other time in the past, because you've been with your child alone for 4 to 5 months. Go ahead, Jodie.
No, I think this is the document you were talking about. It wasn't obviously the next slide. This is from an organization called COPA, Council of a Parent Attorney Advocate. Okay. And they wrote a document that was 2 or 3 pages long about, in a response to questions about compensatory education. And one of the things they said here is parents should have a significant voice in specifying the student's current level of performance. Now, my take on this is your voice will only be as loud as, and I'm not saying you have to go in screaming, but it will only be heard if you make sure it's heard. And I preface this with, from my past experience. So I don't know if every district is going to be like this, and I'm not saying anything about a specific district here, but generally speaking, what I usually have clients come in and tell me, I'll tell them advice and they'll say, I did that, and they told me they couldn't. Or they said that it didn't matter because they needed their own data. They said that what I think isn't really important because it's what's happening at school, right? Some of you have probably heard those same things. That's what I get in my office a lot. But think about, the tables have kind of turned here, right? So think about when you're in the normal position before COVID and you're asking for data. Sometimes it's really hard for our school districts to produce the data. You're like, they said, your child met the goal. Well, show me the data that they met the goal, because when I try to get them to do it at home, they can't do it, right? Show me the data. We need to be able to produce that same data. We have been the data keepers. Whether we've kept the data or not is on us, but we've been in control of the data because we've been the one there with the child day in and day out since March. So we're the ones who can speak about what has been happening regarding distance learning. So you need to go in with the idea, have confidence in yourself is what I'm trying to say. You are the custodian of the data since March. So you need to go in knowing that from March till now is not a dataless time. It's not a time that's completely lost and void of information on your child. It just has narrowed down the source of information solely to you. But the school district still needs to understand that that is valuable data. Those are valuable input. And it should be given even more weight. Parents' input should always, it seems really clear to me the way Congress wrote IDEA, parent input should always be important. But now more so than ever. And I think that's what this document is kind of pointing out. And I think, Nikki, this is what you were talking about.
Right, absolutely.
All right, I'm gonna try and find where we were. I jumped ahead because I was curious too who it was from. Okay, so now we're gonna take a look at some guidance given later in March. So this was from the United States Department of Education from two of their offices, the Office for Civil Rights and the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services in March earlier this year. And it, much like the other, was a guidance document, not necessarily controlling in court or anything, but it gives us guidance. And there's just something I wanted to point out here. They remember I mentioned earlier this is the guidance document where they talked about flexibility. Both the school districts and the parents have the ability under IDEA to preserve their rights while still being flexible. And they talk a little bit, we're not going to go into this a ton, but they talk about how there are ways for us to still be flexible in our determination of how FAPE is to be provided. It is going to have to be a little different with distance learning. Unfortunately, we just have to accept and embrace that the best that we can. But it also talks about collaborate creatively. So we collaborate with each other, us and the school district. We as the parents and the advocates, we collaborate as a team with the school district. And see, I'm not even the only one who says be creative. This is from our federal government telling us, we're advising you to be creative, right? So go in with different possible solutions. It's gonna, find a group online, chat with each other, help each other come up with some ideas, have some brainstorming sessions, whatever it takes for you to get those creative juices flowing. All right, so we'll give you a start here, brainstorming some of these ideas. So I think these remote access capabilities, I included this because I have already had a couple of clients who maybe they don't have reliable internet, so they need to ask for a hotspot from the school district. Maybe they only have one computer at home and they've got 3 kids, right? So do you have the resources that your child needs just to access distance learning, if it's online? Do they need some sort of a phone or a tablet or something? So I think that's pretty simple. But this is where a lot of the creativity can come into play, or the modalities of instruction. I think we can add in here some of the things Nikki pointed out when we first started with the different types of instruction, even distance learning instruction having 2 or 3 different types there. But think about any of the ways that your child accesses learning. Are there websites or apps? So I do have a client who bought a whole bunch of apps, and her child has been learning really well from them. Much better, they think, than some of the packets the school district sent out. And so maybe there's something like that. Maybe the school district could help provide the device and some of the apps that your child might respond to. Maybe they are ones that really like the paper packets, and maybe your school district's going, no, we're all online now. Well, maybe you can ask for your individualized plan to include some of those paper packets, because your kid loves crayons and does really well when he can do that, better than when he has to move the mouse around on the computer, right? But just different types of instruction. These are all very basic, but we need to get creative there. Do you have any input there, Nikki, on modalities?
Yeah. Don't forget that this is all about access, right? And so your child could very likely have different access needs in the home than he or she did in the classroom. And the child's needs, whether they change or not, the school's obligation to meet those needs still remains. So, in the spring, we saw the schools trying to do what they could. There were lots of barriers to providing meaningful education. There were issues about equality. Arguments were raised about equality. They were raised, issues about, not everybody has a computer and that's not fair, and we can't, we seriously can't provide computers to every child. That was the spring, and things look a lot different now. If your child doesn't have access to the internet, if your child doesn't have a computer, that is an educational access issue, and that's an accommodation issue, and the school district needs to provide those in order to provide FAPE. So, school districts are getting very creative now, and they're offering a lot more tools and resources than they were in the spring. I know that there are schools, districts that are providing hotspots for internet access, schools providing laptops, Chromebooks. So just talk to your school. Your child, by virtue of his or her disability that your child did not ask for, they have some extra rights and safeguards. So if your child needs that to access his or her education, the district needs to provide that. So make your request known. I'm looking at Jodie's list of modalities of instruction, and my eye goes straight to the one-to-one instruction. We all know how expensive one-to-one and paras are, and we know we're not supposed to talk about money. It is very easy to send speech language therapists to homes, assuming that parents are comfortable with that, and assuming you can find a provider that's willing to do that. You can send you can send a speech language pathologist to the home. You can send a physical therapist to the home. You can just as easily send a para. And if your child had a one-to-one in class, and your child still requires a one-to-one to stay focused and to, to look at the computer screen and be engaged, I don't see any real meaningful barrier to that service continuing in your home. So you're probably going to hear no and plan for no, because if you plan for no, then you have the answer that is going to, you have your counter argument to that answer no. So, I just really think that there's no limit to what we can imagine, and all you have to do is be persuasive enough to get them to realize that they have to give you a reasonable explanation why the answer is no, or they have to meet your expectation, meet your request. So I have found
that prior written notice can be very helpful, because they may tell you, well, health regulations say that we can't send somebody. A prior written notice, if properly done, will tell you exactly what regulation they're referring to. Instead of just this grand statement of, well, regulations won't let us, it should tell you. You can look up that regulation, look up what it says. And like Nikki said, it then gives you notice of, is this something that I agree with? That I'm like, oh, okay, well, I didn't realize the restrictions were that restrictive. Or maybe you read it and you go, you know what, this doesn't say what they think it says. And now you know whether that's something you want to keep advocating for or not. But I do want to add, one-to-one instruction it can be done online as well. So like here on Zoom, you can even do what they call breakout rooms. So if your child, say they already had a one-to-one aide in their classroom, I don't see why the aide can't attend the classroom. And if the child isn't paying attention, maybe do a breakout room and see if now that they're getting one-on-one with just their aide, are they able to pay more attention now? Maybe that will help. And we're going to talk in another slide a little bit about some of them coming into your home, and there's some guidance on our state education, Department of Education's website, but I'm jumping ahead a little there. I do want to mention this other column here. How will any of the modalities, because these are all modalities that will probably apply to all children, regardless of whether they have a disability, how will they be individualized to your child's needs, and how will they align with their IEP? So one of my biggest issues personally with my son, I tend to air my son's problems in these meetings sometimes, is that I felt like his IEP goals did not get addressed during distance learning. He got to attend, if he was able to and in the right mood that day, he got to attend his class instruction online, but it was a class lesson that was taught to everybody in his class, and his goals largely weren't aligned with the class curriculum, right? His IEP goals, because of the nature of his disability, were usually something they worked on after the class lecture, when we're traditionally in brick and mortar, or on a separate time. None of that got addressed unless I was willing to do it, right, and able. And so how are we individualizing these modalities to his needs? So how are we making sure that our child is still able to make progress on their IEP goals? Because that is something IDEA makes very clear, is in fact, we do that when we determine what setting they're going to be educated in, where we specifically talk about which setting will allow them to make progress on their IEP goals. So that's something we need to look at. Are we actually making progress on them? Maybe they're a type of goal that cannot be implemented beyond any of our creative thinking in a distance learning plan. So maybe during distance learning time, maybe we have a different goal. I just made up my own for my son and taught him new chores at home and told myself, okay, those are his IEP goals, even though they're not in his IEP. But it was my way of handling everything in my head when I felt like the school was mad scrambling and it really wasn't going to be too useful to try and ask for an individualized distance learning plan. But now that we're heading into fall with all of this distance learning in our future, I absolutely think we need to individualize it, right? But maybe we need to change some of the goals for the distance learning time. Maybe not. Maybe it's just what modalities can we use to help them make progress on those goals? If we can't think of anything, then let's think of more appropriate goals to work on during distance learning time. And again, it's not going to replace the other ones. It doesn't replace the current IEP. It just becomes that contingent plan that gets triggered on distance learning. again, you need to look at baselines. I know we talked about this before, but we have to, if we're going to monitor whether or not they're making progress, we have to have baselines about where they are right now. So that's something else we need to think about. And then how are we going to monitor the progress? Who's going to do the monitoring? How is it going to be measured? How is it going to, how is it going to be recorded? How often is it going to be recorded? How am I going to learn about it? Who's going to inform me about that progress, right? If I'm at home being one of the, trying to help facilitate the learning, how am I going to know who the monitor, whatever they're monitoring, am I going to get that information?
And Jodie, I would add about communication and updates from teachers. You were just talking about. So one of the things that the governor has done, he left the number of school days the same, but he has reduced the number of minutes per school day. And that was done to allow more flexibility for the teachers. And so I'm not an educator, and I thank God every day that there are people willing to educate, because I couldn't do it. I think teachers are essential workers. So God bless them. My point is, there is a little bit more time built into their school day to allow for those sorts of things. So teachers are going crazy, with all that they have to do, but there is more time there for them. So they should be able to communicate with you on a regular basis. And now more than ever, it's so important.
Yeah, they do have quite the tasks ahead of them, for sure. All right, so now we're going to take a look at, and this is kind of addressing that one-to-one issue here that we were talking about. There's a little bit of guidance that we're given. This is from our state, California Department of Education. They have a short series of questions and some guidance answers. So here, this question particularly asks, is a local education agency precluded from providing services to students with disabilities in person or in the home for the purpose of supporting the student in accessing the alternative options for learning being offered? So my shorthand for that is, are school districts not allowed to send one-to-one people into our homes to help our children, right? So the answer, they say, is no, they're not precluded. So they might still be able to send somebody into your home. So the answer is not a hard no, we can't send somebody. But what they describe as the reason somebody may be able to come to your home is a very specific reason. So here, they can, if it's for the purpose of supporting the student in accessing the alternative options for learning. So now, Nikki, this is where I'm going to need some of your input to make this clear. I think what this is saying is, if your child is unable to access the learning, then maybe we can send somebody in. But there's actually something before it that I think makes it even more meaningful. So this is what I think most people are going to read. Sorry, that's what I meant to say, is this blue section is what most people are going to read and hang their hat on. If it's for the purpose of supporting my student accessing these alternative modes of learning. Well, if they can only learn when somebody's right in front of their face, then absolutely, I need that one-to-one in my house. But look at these previous words. In order to maintain the student's mental or physical health and safety. So what I think they're really saying here is, if we need to help keep them in the right mindset that they're able to access learning. So if they have issues from distance learning that are causing them to be mentally unstable or physically unhealthy, then maybe we can send somebody into their home. Nikki, do you read that any differently, or do you have a better way of stating it to clarify?
No, but I will admit that I missed that the first time, and I focused on the part that's highlighted in blue right now. And to me, I read that, okay, support the student. Of course, that's what this is all about, right? Accessing the education and getting them what they need to benefit from their education. But the part that's right before it, Jodie, as you pointed out to me earlier tonight, it feels like a nugget that we just uncovered. It feels like those might be the magic words that we need to use to unlock this. So at least we know that the district is not precluded from sending someone into your home. Now, they may say that home visits go against CDC guidelines and those sorts of things, and there may be other reasons they throw up that they don't, that will support their reason for saying no. But to me, right there, to maintain the mental, physical health and safety, for the purpose of supporting the student. To me, that feels like the magic word. And Jodie, you had a theory on essential workers and how
Yes.
if you incorporate a mental, physical health component, maybe that makes it a little bit easier to do.
Well, it's technically not my theory, it's the rest of this paragraph. So if you are on the actual website, right, I kind of cut and pasted from the website to put it on these slides, but it goes on to say, in such cases, these service providers may be considered essential workers because mental and physical health is something that has been deemed essential services. So if your child is not, if they're not mentally healthy or not physically healthy, and therefore they cannot access their education, now the school, what your normal speech therapist now becomes an essential worker. Because think about it. So easy for me to picture because I have a nonverbal child. If you've got somebody who has limited communication skill and now they're not getting their speech therapy, their communication skills are getting, they're regressing day by day by day, more and more and more, right? It almost, from a parent perspective, feels exponential. Like one day he lost 2 words, the next day, oh my gosh, it's 20 words. And then all of a sudden it's 100 words, right? Almost overnight. And so now your child is more frustrated. And so what do? They start engaging in self-injurious behaviors. Maybe they're banging their head on the wall or pulling their hair or whatever it is. They're frustrated and they don't have the words to say how frustrated they are or why they're frustrated. So they start engaging in this unhealthy behavior. So now you've got a student who has mental and physical health issues precluding them from learning. And now your speech pathologist becomes an essential worker because they can come back into their life and give them some of that language back and help them redevelop the language. And that's how I automatically thought of that. That's a really extreme example, but I think it paints the picture of what they're trying to describe here of when a normal just school therapist or instruction becomes essential to maintain health and physical well-being. Anything else there before we move on, Nikki?
No, I would just add, I have made the request for a one-to-one of some sort into the home of a client. And what I heard was, as I said a moment ago, home visits go against the CDC guidelines. And so the answer is no. And, my answer to that is, yes, they do. However, so does leaving your home and going to the grocery store or getting on a bus to go across town. In California, we're not busing our children to school right now, but we may in 9 weeks, who knows? So my answer to that would be that we are living in a world today of guidelines and mandates, and those are just the facts. And there's no law there's no law that's going to guide us in that respect, but you have to ask yourself, we got to weigh the risks. That's what lawyers do every day. We weigh the risks. And, I think that the education of our children, there's very little that's more important, and the window of opportunity that we have to educate these children is fleeting and it's so fast. So, it's just a guideline. And, there are differing opinions about whether school districts are obligated to follow those guidelines. And some superintendents feel absolutely we cannot go against the guidelines, but it's not law. It is a guideline. So,
and something else to keep in mind, if the school district says, no, none of our workers can, none of our speech therapists can come. Now, some of you may laugh when I say this because these types of requests normally and very frequently are completely shot down at Iep meetings, but I think it's completely appropriate to say, well, there's private speech providers who will come into my home. So let's talk about funding my child's speech therapy. You can contract with that private agency and they can send somebody, right? Now, like I said, some of you may be just rolling on the floor laughing because quite often when we make those types of requests, they do get shot down. But at the very least, it has now been brought up to your team as a possibility. And again, this is one of those times where you can say, well, then I would like a prior written notice as to why. And we all know money is a motivating factor, but it isn't something under IDEA that the school district can burden the parents with. So they should not, in that prior written notice, be saying, well, it's because it's going to cost way too much to send a private therapist. Well, that really isn't a legal reason for them to put in an IEP or in a prior written notice document. And so they now have to tell you why your child doesn't need that, or specifically what order they're going to refer to that says they can't send somebody. And now you've got this executive order N3320 right here that you can find on CDE's website that can maybe say, okay, but what about this that demonstrates or says that, yes, we can send an essential worker in. Again, just conversations you can have with your team to put things out there to say, these are possible solutions, to be creative in how they can be delivered. And I think those are both, whether they send their school psychologist or school therapist, or whether they pay an outside therapist. If your child needs it for their physical and mental well-being, then they are essential workers, and somebody can come to your child is the bottom line.
And it doesn't have to be in your home. You know, I think there would be some concern about having strangers coming in my home that have been in other people's homes. You know, you can do that safely elsewhere. You can be outside, you can meet at a park, you can sit on your front lawn, you can sit 6 feet apart. You know, I think you would have to ask yourself, is it worth the risk to have something, some sort of delivery of service on a one-to-one sort of basis when the alternative is nothing, or a phone call, or something. You know your child the best, and what can your child tolerate, and what will your child, you know, how will he or she succeed? So, but just know, again, be creative. There are ways to do this safely with the masks and outside in the sunshine. And so, you know, just open up that brain.
Okay, so here's a couple of quick slides on prior written notice. So that you're aware a little bit more about them. If the school wants to evaluate your child or have an IEP meeting about your child, they should give you prior written notice. But here's the part we've been talking about. If you make a request and they refuse your request to either evaluate your child, to make changes to their IEP or their placement, now you have a right to have prior written notice. Notice about exactly why. And here's what the content of it should by federal law include. A prior written notice must include a description of the actions either proposed or refused. So think about it. Even if you called an IEP meeting and said, I want to individualize my child's distance learning plan. I hope none of the responses are this, but let's say your school district's response is, no, we don't do that. We don't do individualized distance learning plans. Right there, they have now refused your proposal, and you should get prior written notice that tells why they're refusing to even discuss a distance learning plan that's individualized. They should explain why they don't want to do an individualized plan. They should also list any assessments, procedures, records, or reports they used to reach that conclusion. A description of any options that they did consider and reasons they didn't do those either, and a description of any other relevant factors. So there's a lot of times there can be pretty useful information in those prior written notice documents, which is why we have mentioned them so many times tonight. Okay, and we did look at this a little bit here where it mentions that document from COPA, which is a students advocacy group, right? And you can look them up. They've got some pretty good resources as well, where they point out parents should have a significant voice. We talked about that. I know we're running low on time, so I'm going to go through some of this more quickly. But I do like how they point out here that if the achievement gap has widened due to the closure, the team is obliged to provide more intensive services than those provided in the prior IEP. So my first thought, again, I go to my own son, I go into his speech therapy immediately and think, oh, maybe he was only getting 30 minutes a month. Now maybe we need to do 30 minutes twice a month, right? Now maybe instead of, let's up it. Let's up the services he's getting to try and make up for the gap that was created during the closure. So that's something we can also kind of talk about. So we're kind of shifting though the focus of these last few minutes of the meeting. Most of what we've talked about up to this point is an individualized distance learning plan. This now is looking at when we're back in place, when we're back, right? And the school's able to now provide services. It doesn't mean they can't do more intensive services during distance learning, but really these next couple of slides before we close tonight are more looking at what can we do when we're actually back in brick and mortar, back on campus. Maybe that's when we start talking about, let's intensify these services for the child, because now we've got this probably year-long or more gap to make up for. I mean, who knows when we'll actually really be back, right? So something else that the same document points out is, okay, before I get to that, here, this term compensatory education. So they even, and very rightly point out, school administrators do not like the term compensatory education. And there's good reason for them not liking it. Up until this point, at least, compensatory education is a term that's very punitive in nature, right? Courts use that to say, oh, school districts, you did not provide FAPE, so now you have to provide compensatory education. You now have to give the student money to go get private tutoring or private therapy or something of that nature. And so it's usually looked on as, you know, bad school district. You didn't do what you were supposed to do the first time, so now you have to pay for this to be done right by somebody else. And in this case, school districts didn't cause the need for the schools to close. You know, it wasn't the school's fault that the world had a COVID-19 outbreak. It wasn't their fault that they weren't equipped with distance learning material on March 16th or 13th. And so school districts are looking at it as, we shouldn't be punished for something we didn't do wrong. And so maybe what they're pointing out here is, maybe instead of using terms like compensatory education, that's going to kind of automatically raise defensive flags on your IEP team's part, we need to look at it more as remedial services. What services can the district provide now, maybe additional, or what can they provide with more intensity to help the student try and catch back up? Now, Nikki, you had mentioned earlier, I think it was our earlier discussion, we did have a brief meeting before we came on, guys, to talk about what we were going to talk about. Nikki mentioned, you know, you hear all the time, every student is going to regress, regardless of whether or not they have a disability. And that's true. I have two kids, one with and one without a disability, and they've both regressed. My son, however, the one with the disability, he has regressed exponentially more than his sister has. And I'm confident in his abilities to recuperate, but I already know it's going to be at a much slower rate than his sister. His sister's going to catch back up. It's not really going to alter the trajectory of her life that much. Now, this school closure on my son, it could technically alter how independent his life is going to be in the future because of this shutdown, especially if he doesn't get some of those remedial, more intensive services later. So I guess the whole point here, and Nikki, chime in with your input, is maybe we don't use the term compensatory education and send up those red flags. Maybe we talk about how the school district can up the services intensity and type to help our children make up for this time in some way.
You know, I told you earlier, Jodie, that I was really surprised because this concept of compensatory education to make up for the widening gap that started in March. We first heard this in the March 2020 guidance, and I was really surprised because as a parent side attorney, compensatory education is almost a dirty word, right? It's like damages in a civil court. Compensatory education is, you know, that's what comes out of a settlement agreement, and it is very punitive. So when they were talking about compensatory education, you know, I kind of shuddered a little bit back in March because I thought, oh, that's always a fight for comp ed, right? And nobody really likes to talk about that. So I was surprised that they used that term. But however, I think that the general consensus about compensatory education and how that makes us feel is going to change going forward because the budget that was just approved here in California includes, I'm flipping back through my notes, it literally includes, a certain amount of money for compensatory education, state funded money that's going to, I don't know how it's going to be divvied up or how it's going to be allocated, but literally it's to make up for the services that special education children didn't get during this closure. So I think we're going to have a softer approach to that term going forward, but I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about comp ed going when we return.
And that kind of leads to one of the last things I want to point out. This is just warning, this is a little disheartening, this slide. As I explain it, you'll see why. So let's follow this timeline quickly. So here we are in August. School's about to begin next week if it hasn't already. So that's going to start the clock on your IEP request, right? So we're going to take this journey on this timeline, assuming you're going to be wanting to ask for compensatory education services. This is what I anticipate. If I had a crystal ball, this is what I anticipate it would show. So even if you were to get that clock started by turning in your IEP request now, you're looking at probably sometime in mid-September to hold an initial IEP meeting. Now, you all know as well as I do, you're probably not going to get your individualized distance learning plan finalized in that first initial very quick meeting. They're going to have to reconvene 2 or 3 times probably, right? So even best case scenario, let's say you do get it done in September. So now you've got a little bit of time for your kid to have a distance learning plan. Great. Now, I'm assuming a best case scenario. I don't actually know that schools are going to open in October, and I highly suspect they probably won't. And even if they do, I anticipate a lot of open and close as we have breakouts, right? So, but let's assume best case scenario, we're back to brick and mortar learning in October and we never have to close again, okay? Again, we're just assuming here. Let's say now you're going, okay, let's talk about compensatory education. Well, the school district will likely say to you, well, we need to give your child time to reacclimate to learning in person. We can't do an assessment to find out if they've even regressed until we give them time to reacclimate. Moreover, another point of compensatory services that the courts will take into consideration, and so should your IEP team, is the rate of recoupment. How fast does your child relearn the skill they lost? So we're going to need at least 8 weeks to figure all that out before we can even start the assessment, right? And with it, so if that starts in November, you've got November, a week off, you got part of December, and about the same time that 8-week mark accrues, now you're looking at winter break. So, and that again, best case scenario, assuming we're open in October. So now we're in January and they're going to say something like, well, they had winter break, so let's give them a couple weeks to reacclimate again. Then we'll start the assessments. So they're probably best case scenario, end of January, early February, going to start the assessments. Well, at that point, they have 60 days to assess and then hold another IEP meeting to determine if your child in fact does have is entitled to compensatory education. I can already see some people shaking their heads. I know, I told you this was not good news. You're looking at March when you can actually hold the meeting to talk about what the assessments said. And if the school district did assessments you don't agree with, and I'm guessing they might because they're going to have so many requests to do assessments, they're going to be going through them so quickly, they're going to make mistakes. You're then going to want an IEE, which starts a whole nother 2 to 6 month process of getting those IEE results. So at best case scenario, I anticipate the team being able to actually discuss compensatory education. Absolute best case scenario being June. Meanwhile, your child has spent all this time regressing, right? Because they're not getting, even if they're back to brick and mortar, they're still not getting what they need because our eye is focused on compensatory education. And I'm not saying don't focus on that. Nikki already pointed out there's specific monies that are being set aside for that. You absolutely have a right to that if your child truly needs it. But in the meanwhile, you can head down this path, but don't just let this be your sole path. Let those remedial services and that idea of maybe making what they do receive more intensive, let that fill in some of the gaps here while we're doing this. And yes, it might lessen your argument that your child is entitled to compensatory education, because if they're getting the intensive services now, their regression won't be as much, but that's the outcome we want anyway, right? Our goal isn't to get the school district to pay for compensatory education. Our goal is to get our children the best future they can have by giving them the services they need now. So that's what I think one of the big takeaways as far as compensatory education is don't just hold off and think, well, we'll get it in a year or two. We'll get it in a year or two. Fight for some of those remedial intensified services as soon as you're able to. I know I tend to get on soapboxes every once in a while. I got really passionate there, but Nikki, what do you got to say about that?
I concur with everything that you just said, Jodie. Everything. Yeah.
All right. So we have 6 minutes, so we're not going to have a lot of time for Q&A. I am going to tell you guys right now, I have a couple more slides, so don't jump off just yet. I have not had a lot of time to read your questions, but I am going to turn your questions into a Word document, and I am going to read them. So at the very least, maybe it's something that I can put forth we're going to introduce a Brenn Clinic newsletter. So maybe we can start answering some of those questions there. I'm not going to make your questions just completely meaningless. So if you have asked a question that we haven't addressed here, I will try and find a way to disseminate some of that information in the future. But I do want to end with this in mind. So this again is from our California Department of Education, and it specifically says, at this time, the federal government has not waived the federal requirements under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So IDEA is the body of law that governs special education. They have not. The federal government waived one tiny little thing in Part C, but I'm going to tell you right now, 99% of our concerns are governed by Part B, and nothing in Part B of IDEA was waived. So our State Department of Education goes on to say, until and unless the U.S. Department of Education ultimately provides flexibilities under federal law, local education agencies should do their best in adhering to IDEA requirements, including federally mandated timelines, to the maximum extent possible. LEAs are encouraged to consider ways to use distance technology to meet those obligations. So the rights your child had before the closure are the same rights your child had during the closure. None of those rights changed. The reality of how the services can be delivered might have changed, but your child was still entitled to a free, appropriate public education.
Appropriate for that child.
Mm-hmm. And as parents, you're the ones who really can help your team, even more so than before, help your team individualize the plan, right? I mean, I've always said that parents know the child best and can help give tidbits of how to individualize an IEP like nobody else on that team can. But that has been intensified and magnified at this time. We are the teacher, the therapist, I mean, even more so than we usually are because of the way distance learning has had to be employed. So do whatever you need to do to make sure your voice is not swept under the rug at your IEP team. Your voice has always been meaningful and is even more meaningful right now, if that's even possible. So take that and have that give you the confidence you need to advocate for your child to have two things that we've talked about tonight, and probably even more, but we've talked about individualized distance learning plan and intensified remedial services. And there we go. I think that's all we have for tonight. I need like a drum roll at the end.
Do we have time to take a few of these questions, or do you want to just address them in writing?
Were you able to read any that you'd like to talk about? I haven't really even had a chance to look.
Yeah, there's some great questions in here, and I'd love an opportunity to respond to those, and maybe you and I can do that. Maybe we can both add some thoughts on these questions and share that with your viewers. There's one here that masks are a particularly hot topic in my home, and one viewer asks, is there a state mandate in California that says my child needs to wear a mask at school as her sensory issues and disability makes it impossible for her to keep it on? And that's very simple. If your child won't wear a mask or there is an issue with that, seek a medical waiver or an accommodation for the disability, and that shouldn't be any problem at all. Even in the governor's mandate, there is an exception under medical issues and mental health issues, and so use the opportunity to include in your child's IEP steps to get the kid the sensory issues are a little different, but if the child won't wear it or can't wear it or doesn't know how to wear it properly, use the IEP as an opportunity to teach that child, incorporate some one-to-one services to get that child acclimated. This is our life for a while, so let's address it. If you know it's going to be an issue, address it now with an amendment and put that concern in writing. Masks and hand washing are new life skills, and that's appropriate for adaptive functioning on that IEP. Even parent training, and we can teach that kid how to put it on and correctly wear it and correctly wash their hands. So there's a lot of good that can come from addressing that now.
So I do want to point out, I just read a couple of questions while you were sharing that answer. I'm going to stop sharing this and start sharing something else with you. Give me a second to bring up the other screen. Okay, so there's a couple of questions that I think are something we have answered on past webinars. Not that you have tons of time to go in and listen to me and or Nikki talking, but if you go to our website, basically it's sjcl.com. I know it gets kind of complicated up here, but sjcl.com will get you to the school's website. And then if you click in the right up-hand corner, Brenn, it takes you to this page. So on this page, we've got a coronavirus resource area. If you click on there, it brings up some of our past webinars. So some people have asked a couple of questions about timelines that are waived and things like that. So this first webinar was done by local therapy providers, giving us ideas about how we can work with our kids at home. But the more legal ones are down here. So there's a couple of them that are going to talk about, I think this is the one that talks about, no, this top one talks about the closures, the waivers of timelines. What specific timelines were waived and what weren't. And then you've also got, this one here is Nikki and I on the second week after the closures, I believe, right? We went into a lot more detail about the guidance document than we did today. Specifically all about that document. We brought up a couple things about it. And this is another one that talks about guidelines, state guidelines. One was federal and one was state here. And there's also a lot of resources, and the ones I talked about tonight, I'll have listed here in the next day or two as well. So any documents I've referred to, they're probably already listed. I think the only one that isn't here is that COPA document, which I will list as well. So you can access that on our website to get some more of that information. Technically, our time is done. We were scheduled for 8 o'clock. I don't know if you need to go, Nikki, or if you want to stay and answer some more of these questions. But it is something that I will try, Nikki and I will work together to try and put together some answers and make it a resource available to you.
I'm good to stick around for a few more minutes if you like. If there are anything that you
Did you see any other questions you'd like to address tonight?
There was a question about assessment timelines, and AB 177 did remove those restrictions on school districts. Not just timelines, but timelines for assessment, but timelines for responses to appeals, timelines for records, production of records, educational records. We all know 5 days, and that timeline has been relaxed. I do know I have successfully worked around that exception of AB 177 for records requests. So if anybody is facing that problem, reach out to me privately, and I can tell you how to work around that. But yes, assessment timelines have been waived.
It does, the guidance itself, I believe, said we should still try, school districts should still try to meet those deadlines or make efforts to provide it in a timely manner. But yeah, they've been relaxed a lot.
There was an interesting comment about independent homeschool program. Our district has an independent homeschool program, starts August 13th. All students that wanted to be a part of the independent homeschool program were accepted, except students that have an IEP, which to me screams discrimination. Students cannot be accepted into the independent homeschool program until after the child's IEP because of a change of placement. And this was the comment that said students will have an IEP within the first 3 days of school. What are your thoughts on that? My thoughts are you cannot exclude a child with a disability from anything by virtue of his or her disability. So, I would sure think that, I would hope that's the district's way of saying, we're going to put more emphasis on the requirement that the IEP team has to meet first before a change of placement, rather than the anti-discrimination laws. But it doesn't seem to me like that should be a change of placement. An independent homeschool program, to me, that's a homeschool program, and homeschooling is disenrolling from the school district. The school is no longer obligated to provide FAPE or any education of any time, or providing curriculum. And so I would be very hesitant to enter my child into a homeschool program. But to me, that kind of feels like what we're doing at home anyway, distance learning. So again, my caution would be just be very hesitant before accepting any change of placement during this very uncertain time.
Yeah, I echo that. I agree. Again, if you're able to make it more of a contingency, we're only doing this type of delivery of service or this particular environment because of the restrictions in place. Then you're hopefully preserving that placement that you had before the closure when we're able to go back.
There is a question from Bridget Holt. If we signed up for the hybrid model option, do we have the right to fight for our child to be included in the classroom part and do services after the half-day schedule? We noticed our child felt more part of her classroom when on the class Zoom call and having service Zoom calls at a different time. The first question is, do we have the right to fight for our child to be included in the classroom part? The answer is absolutely, unequivocally, yes. You have the right to fight for everything, and you should. You can ask for anything under the sun. The tricky part is getting the district to agree to that. But I would need more information about this. But by all means, if you can represent to the IEP team that your child with a disability feels more included and part of her classroom when she is allowed to be part of that delivery of services on Zoom, it would be a very interesting answer if they said, nope, sorry, we don't buy it. Like, to me, that's everything. If you think about it, the default right, the big fat civil right, is education with their non-disabled peers. And to me, that sounds like that's what you're describing. So by all means, that feels like a very strong position. So Bridget Holt, you should definitely fight for your child's right to be included in that part of her hybrid.
And just like at any other IEP meeting, your goals and services hinge on the present levels. So if at the present level stage of the IEP meeting, and these distance learning plans have to have a present levels discussion as well, right? At that stage, if you're able to help the team identify certain needs that your child has, and if one of them is the ability to address the class or to be around, even virtually, see their friends' faces, right? If they have a need to work on that, if they've got a deficit in that area, that gives you a right to a corresponding goal. And if you've got a goal, now we have to look at what services need to be in place to help them reach that goal. And so that's how I would advise you, just generally speaking, to go about setting the stage so that now you've got a right to ask for a particular goal or service. All right. Again, I haven't really had a chance to read through the questions. I can't talk passionately and read questions at the same time, apparently.
If the student has a one-to-one aide, I'm assuming that means in his or her current IEP, is the district responsible to provide the one-to-one in the home? Hopefully we covered that. There are lots of considerations and lots of factors at play. We talked about CDC guidelines. We talked about, risk of, exposure in the home. But you have a very strong position or argument that if you have been able to show and convince the IEP team, because indeed it's in the IEP, that the child needs a one-to-one aid to access his or her education, nothing has changed. That child probably has an even greater need for a one-to-one aid. So again, make the request, and if they tell you no, ask them to explain to you clearly and in writing why the answer is no. But to me, if that was my case, that would be pretty easy to kind of bird dog that one. So I don't know if you could say the district was responsible, but the district is responsible to provide FAPE to your child. And if FAPE in the brick and mortar was a one-to-one aid, tell me why FAPE in your home is not a one-to-one aid in your home is not FAPE. So,
or even a one-to-one on, like on, you know, virtually learning, like,
Right.
because they may say, well, if they can still access it by virtual learning, by distance learning, then we don't need to send somebody into the home. And that may be a true statement. So then the question is, well, would a one-to-one person giving them virtual instruction, instead of having to share the teacher with 8 or 30 other students, if they had somebody giving them one-to-one tutoring type instruction online, would they now be able to access it? Maybe that's an appropriate question or dialogue to have, right? And maybe that won't even work, in which case now you can kind of gear the conversation towards maybe they can send somebody to your home or meet in the park like we talked about. But all of it's going to hinge on our ability, I think a lot of it anyway, on our ability to help the team think creatively as far as coming up with some of these solutions. I did, not to keep derailing from the questions, but I did want to point out, and Nikki, if you've got something you want to point out about your firm, please do so. But here at the clinic, you're able to set up a consultation. We have a link here on our website, again, sjcl.edu, and then you can click on the Brenn in the top right-hand corner. You're always welcome to give us a donation. We accept those too. You can find us on Facebook. You can join our mailing list. Like I said, we are putting out a newsletter hopefully soon. But what I really wanted to point out was you can schedule a consultation. And as long as we have space, we'll take consultations. So you click on that and it will give you dates when we have openings. It's a very simple thing to do. You select a time and then you're going to get a series of emails from the clinic to set, you know, with a couple of forms you got to fill out before we can meet with you. But that's some way where you can now tell us a little bit more about your specific details, and we can see if we can help you brainstorm some ideas or come up with some possible solutions to take to your team.
One more question I would like to answer. Okay. This is from Angie Silva. If I believe all the options the school offers are inappropriate for my child, and I just want to take him to private services every day, can I do that without disenrolling him from school? And the answer is absolutely yes. And I would not recommend disenrolling your child from school, because once you disenroll that child, the school has no obligation to provide FAPE to your child any longer, assuming he or she is he's on the IEP. So the way that this works is you can ask the district in advance to provide the services. Apparently they have said no because you're not happy with them. And then you can ask the district, if you take this child to this provider, will the school district reimburse you for that? It's always best to ask up front. It kind of puts the school district on notice that this is kind of, you know, the path that you're traveling down. And it also sets you up for the prior written notice, right? Which is the written reason for the denial of the request. And the way that it works is this: if you can show later down the road through a due process hearing that the school district's IEP was not appropriate for your child, there is case law that says any out-of-pocket expenses that you incurred as the parent, making up for what the district did not provide, you will be reimbursed for that. And there's very strong case law that supports that. So, you know, you can either get funding up front or you can get it on the back end. If you're one of those parents that has the resources up front to pay for it, that's wonderful. Many don't. So just be aware, ask for it up front, and then, you know, start working on your case as to why the district should reimburse you for that. But, and what's really nice, I'll add this as well, because we're in a distance learning situation, and I don't know if you're in California or not, you have more flexibility in your day to take your child to private services. Whereas I've had clients in the past, same situation as you, Angie, where the child, you know, it's brick and mortar school, and mom is taking the child out of school, taking her to speech language services because the district was not providing those. And then to add insult to injury, mom was paying for these out of pocket. Then the district slapped her with a truancy and, you know, SARB'd her, brought her into a SARB hearing for truancy, and took her to task for taking her child out of school. So I hope that makes sense. So the nice thing now is that the circumstances as we are today in distance learning, you have more flexibility to take your child out of school without having to come up against a truancy allegation that you're not keeping your child in his or her seat. So you can do that. Be careful, be cautious, and I would just have very open lines of communication with the district if reimbursement is very important to you.
Good information. All right. I tried to read through some of the questions there. I think you got a lot of them, Nikki. A lot of them that I noticed anyway. And again, when we have more time, we will look over these a little bit more carefully because I'm kind of just skimming through them. Lots of thank yous. You're welcome. Our pleasure, honestly.
Agreed. Thank you. And Jodie, thank you for the opportunity to be a part of your webinar again today.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for coming on. I appreciate your input. It's always nice, especially in these times of so much uncertainty, to have another set of eyes and another, viewpoint. So I guess on the last little note, happy advocating, good luck. We're all in this together. I know you've heard that since March, but really think of it this way. We really are all fighting for our children to have the services that they need. I can tell you from my own personal experience, it is heartbreaking to watch our kiddos suffer through all the regression that they're suffering through right now. And that's why our voices as advocates need to be as powerful as they can be. And hopefully some of the information we've given you tonight will help empower you and make your voice a little bit more powerful as you continue advocating for your child. So thank you for joining us. Nikki, thank you for being here. And I hope everybody has a good night. And hopefully we see you again.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.